Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you, so.
Amazing. Can I just ask, are we going to be
I couldn't hear you. Are we going to be what?
Hello and welcome to the People's Assembly Budget Day breakdown with myself, Laura Pidcock, National Secretary of the People's Assembly, and Michael Burke, our Chief Economist.
Nice chief and only.
We are going to be trying to deconstruct what just happened. We haven't had much time to dissect all of the papers to understand in depth. And as was said 100 times in the chamber, the devil is in the detail. And it is for us too. But we really are going to try and make this as understandable, as accessible as possible about how that budget affects working class people and working communities. So I'm just going to play a little clip from last year before we start our discussion. Michael, if that's all right.
More police, safer streets, more nurses, better healthcare, more teachers, better education. Madam Deputy Speaker, the House now knows what the electorate already knows. The Conservatives are the party of public services.
So apart from, we didn't see there like a really short bit where they all like backslap the Chancellor, and it's really cringe. But have they lived up to that in the last year, Michael? What's your thoughts?
Well, no, they haven't. And one of the things is about the budget is you can go straight to at least the big documents like the OBR one and the Treasury one, and they set some of the big stuff out really straightforwardly. And actually, what happened over the 12 months since the last budget is the government cut spending. It's there in black and white in one of the first tables of the document, and they cut government's current spending by 5.7%. Now, in anybody's book, that's austerity. And engaging in austerity in a pandemic is just, economic vandalism of the highest order. They, so far from being the party of public services, they're the party of deep public services cuts. That's what they actually did.
We'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a second, where we'll think about what some of the offers, if you like, are. But you can't help but think about the arrogance of standing up in the chamber and making a pronouncement like that, that they are the party of public service, they are the party of working people after that decade of austerity. And we now know that a period of austerity like that leading into a health crisis has been absolutely catastrophic, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the austerity in terms of people's general health has a very negative impact. It obviously had a really direct negative impact on the NHS, and it's had a wider negative impact on all our public services, which all are important in getting out of something like a deadly pandemic. And it's 10 years of Tory austerity that have got us to this point.
And just to make everyone aware, you are watching a People's Assembly broadcast. So as always, please like and share the People's Assembly content. It really, really helps us broaden our engagement. And if you have got somebody that today is commenting on Facebook or on Twitter saying, look, the government's doing the best they can, and you want to tag them in this and offer them an alternative view of that budget, please do so. We want to change people's minds. We want people to understand exactly what the government is doing and has done. So let's talk about that budget then, Michael. What are your kind of overall kind of macroeconomics, so the big picture stuff? What was said by the Chancellor?
Well, I think it's another austerity budget. There's no recognition that the government has brought us to this point. You know, you would never know from listening to the Chancellor, and you may not know listening to the very supportive press that the media he gets, that we have the worst outcome in terms of the economy in the G7. And it's not as if the G7, you know, the group of mainly Western, very rich countries have covered themselves in glory in the pandemic. They really haven't. But somehow under this government, we've had the worst outcome of all. And what he does today is he continues austerity. Austerity has two aspects, one of which is taking money off ordinary people in terms of pay cuts or public sector cuts or pay freezes in the case of the public sector. And it's giving money to big business and the rich. And so when the Chancellor gets up and talks about the absolutely enormous numbers of pounds, these billions of pounds of your money he's giving away, he's talking about the giveaways to the rich in general. And austerity continues for ordinary people. Now, it's true that there's some tinkering with some of that in the very short term, but over the longer term, because the forecasts are given for 5 years and the government's plans are given for 5 years, there's no reversal of austerity. There's no apology for it. And actually, as we'll come on to see, I'm sure, Rishi Sunak and the rest of the Tories are very proud of their austerity record.
And it is hard when you're watching the footage of the budget, and they are huge numbers. So I think he talked about £65 billion worth of money in this budget that has been announced. I know then Keir Starmer came back and said, well, you re-announce some things and, you know, there'll be technical details about that. How much do you think will actually be seen by working people of that £65 billion?
Oh, next to nothing. I mean, literally next to nothing. I mean, the criticism that there's re-announcements is true. Unfortunately, it's probably always true. But the giveaways are all for, in the short term, are all for big business and the rich. And some of them are utterly ridiculous. I mean, right at the end of the speech, we had this thing about, what did he call it? The super reduction.
Super deduction.
Of corporate taxes, that's taxes on profits, for investment. So in effect, for every £10 a big business invests, they'll get £13 from the government. I mean, that's just nuts. I mean, I'm a big fan. I've argued repeatedly for increased investment, but bribing people to invest doesn't work. What it leads to is fraud, or at the very least, the misallocation of investment, because, you know, you can get away with it for nothing. Why not chance your arm? It makes much more sense, in my view, for the government to invest on its own account. And given the problems we've got that we had before the pandemic, and we will have them after the pandemic, unfortunately, things like the housing crisis, infrastructure, of course, catastrophic climate change. Well, incentivizing the private sector to invest hasn't worked in the past on any of those. It takes really big scale government investment to do that, and there was none of that in this budget beyond what's going to happen this year as a one-off.
And if people have got any questions that they want to put to Michael, please just send them in. He's here to answer any question that you have. Let's see the clip where Rishi talks about the OBR.
The OBR forecast that our economy will grow this year by 4%, by 7.3% in 2022, then 1.7, 1.6 and 1.7% in the last 3 years of the forecast. And the OBR have said that our interventions to support jobs have worked.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a really clever tactic. When you're speech writing, you've got something that you know probably couched in difficult news, and you drop in what people might say is a reputable organization to kind of validate your claims. What do you make of those claims?
Well, there's two things. One is about the GDP forecast, because you could, exactly as you say, you reel off a load of numbers and oh, that sounds good. The reality is, if you think of where GDP naturally goes to in terms of population growth, increases in productivity and stuff like that, it's as a steady sort of upward slope. What those OBR forecasts show is that there was a big lurch down in the course of last year because of the pandemic, and we're never really going to quite get back up to where we should have been. That's the reality. That's the first thing. And in terms of his policy, I mean, the idea of congratulating yourself for saving jobs, 1.4 million people lost their jobs between March last year and December last year. That hasn't saved jobs. And a recent survey from the Resolution Foundation showed that half of the people on furlough expect to lose their jobs, or been told they're going to lose their jobs. So there's nothing praiseworthy about the Tories' record on jobs in the pandemic, because they didn't care. They prioritised, as we know, with public health and with livelihoods. They prioritised the big interests of big business throughout the whole crisis. They're still doing it.
Can I just, one of the questions that's come in is that the Chancellor didn't mention any council tax rise or investment to fill NHS vacancies. Why do you think that is? I thought there was a mention of council tax rise.
There was, unfortunately, because council taxes are going up by 2 billion. So that's another austerity measure. So yeah, he didn't mention it. That's absolutely true, because the speeches only tend to provide you with the good news, not the bad. So actually, yeah, there is a 2 billion increase in council tax coming your way soon. Which is the continuation of austerity. In terms of was the other question on pay, Laura?
No, it was about NHS, filling NHS vacancies.
Yeah,
I suppose it does speak to the pay issue though as well, doesn't it? You're not going to fill vacancies if you think that you're going to, yeah.
Well, that's exactly. That's why there's a number of factors. The most important one of which is low pay, and people often outside the NHS don't understand now what a high qualification job it is. You know, nurses have to have degrees for the most part. It's and yet their pay is abysmal. Their working conditions are abysmal, and that's even before you get into the current crisis. That's the main thing. Blocking qualified nurses from overseas with a ridiculous immigration policy also doesn't help. And the general mistreatment, things like the absence of PPE and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, there was nothing in the budget about how to fix that crisis beyond the repeating assurances that we've had about the recruitment of nurses and police. My attitude to that is, let's wait and see, especially on the nurses who've had such a rough time. I imagine that some of them will be considering other careers maybe at the end of this.
And if you think about the trauma that they will be experiencing from everything that they've witnessed throughout this crisis, I mean, it is remarkable that there could be a public sector pay freeze before the crisis, but after enduring what they've endured for the last year, it is just absolutely staggering. And these huge PR stunts, you know, we now know that the PR stunts of clapping for all of those key workers and it not being backed up in remuneration for that labour and that stress and that strain is utterly shameless. You know, I also noticed that there's nothing really about extra spending for local authorities or the NHS or anything on social care. Am I wrong? Did I miss that? Was it there in the detail, Michael?
No, that's a really good point. And actually, over the entire period of austerity, ever since 2010, one of the biggest avenues that the Tories have used for cuts is local authority cuts. I mean, local authority budgets have been decimated, and so you don't get to see that in the initial documentation. That's released over the next day or so, on all the supplementary documentation. But it'd be no surprise if yet again there were more cuts to local authority budgets, and many of them now are really back to the bone. There's nothing more that they can cut while maintaining their legal obligations. So that wouldn't be a surprise, because that's how they've done a lot of it in the past. But again, you don't get that from the Chancellor's speech and the initial coverage on the day.
Okay, and let's see what the Chancellor had to say about housing.
A policy that gives people who can't afford a big deposit the chance to buy their own home.
Well, how are the construction sector going to feel about this for boosting their sector and increasing demand, or actually providing what is the real need, which is extra housing?
I think that the construction sector ought to be boosted. I think it's a really important part of the economy and provides very important goods, including public goods like good housing. But that type of policy is not going to do that at all. In fact, when Osborne and Cameron did something really similar in 2013, even Tories criticised it as breaching Economics 101. You know, the first thing you're taught in school about economics is just about the laws of supply and demand. Well, if you increase the availability of deposits and make mortgage lending easier, but you don't provide any new housing, guess what? Prices rise. So yeah, this is a great benefit to landlords and people who own multiple homes, but it's a terrible policy for anyone trying to buy a new home. And people were forced to rent in many cities in the country where they really given up on ever owning their own home. You don't boost housing by boosting the price of housing. You boost housing by building homes, but that wasn't on the agenda at all.
No, it just feels like the world turned upside down almost, and very Orwellian. It was quite a jubilant speech. I felt quite upbeat when we know that people are in the midst of this crisis, still very, very worried about the impact of the coronavirus crisis. Still many groups that are still to be vaccinated. Lots of people who are disabled have been shielding for one whole year, and yet. And also, you know, a huge issue is I know furlough is going to be extended, but the employer contribution is back, it seems, and you know, that huge impending worry about the unemployment figures. You talked about how many more had become unemployed, but that now takes the total to very, very worrying level. We know the practices of employers. He did make a claim in this speech, which I found quite staggering. He said something like, you know, nobody will be worse off. Nobody will be paid less. And I wonder, how can you make such a claim when you are not willing to tackle any of the fundamental problems? So workplace democracy, people having enough democracy in the workplace, enough power in the workplace, that pay freeze that you mentioned, you know, a minimum hourly rate of pay being set so low. All of that means, you know, it feels like a lie.
Well, it's because it is. You know, it's the talking up your own economic policy is never generally a good idea, but especially given the record they've got. The reality is that they brushed over this. They announced the budget last year, the day that they officially accepted that we were being hit by a pandemic. They had nothing ready for a pandemic. In fact, as we know, they cut current government spending quite savagely, among the deepest ever cuts in a single year in the middle of a pandemic. And they never really wanted to accept the reality, which is that if you don't look after public health, you can't possibly look after the economy. You know, it's not the rich Western countries who've done well in this pandemic. They've all done really badly because, to one extent or another, they've put business first. Our government is one of the worst, so we're one of the worst outcomes on both the death toll and on the economy. many other countries in the world put public health first, and guess what? Their economies are thriving. They don't actually accept a completely fundamental aspect of economics, is that the most important factor in the economy is people. They never accept that. They think it's entrepreneurs, and they mean that profits come before everything. And it's been a disaster all through. Every aspect of their policy is geared towards that. It still is. And on the OBR forecasts, they're forecasting unemployment to rise to 5.9%. But they make a couple of other scenarios. And in their worst scenario, which is that they don't even include the possibility that new variants, new mutations might have a new deadly effect, but just that other things don't go as well as the government assumes. And from that, they reckon that unemployment could go to 11%. So that tells you the risks they're taking and how little they're doing to address the real sources of this current crisis.
Well, just let Michael take a little breather there while I tell you about the People's Assembly. If you're watching this because you just wanted to think about the budget in a slightly different way, you are welcome. But the People's Assembly is an anti-austerity movement. And we've just heard from Michael that this was a continuation of an austerity budget. It looks like austerity is going absolutely nowhere. We know that there are ideological underpinnings to that. So it's about what is democratically accountable to people, what is publicly owned, and that the trajectory that the Tories are on is one of privatisation, is of a shrinking of the responsibility of the state to put those resources into private hands. And that has a huge effect on communities and what services we can access, what people are paid, how good our lives can be, what public health is like. And no more has that been seen than in this crisis. And there is something that you can do. So the People's Assembly has local groups. You can get involved in those local groups. I am sure whenever it is possible, whenever it is safe to do so, the People's Assembly will also be organising their renowned kind of national expressions of resistance, a huge protest where we take to the streets. So please look out for that, and we'll do that as soon as it is safe to do so. And please, a really small and simple thing you can do is like and share this live feed. That is so helpful. I just want to go to Rishi Sunak's claim about the last decade and their handling of the economy.
The only reason we have been able to respond as boldly as we have to COVID is because 10 years of Conservative governments painstakingly rebuilt our fiscal resilience.
Yeah, I mean, it's one way of saying that actually we've decimated public services over 10 years. We have put a cap, we have ensured wage stagnation for public servants. It's one way of describing how they have endured, inflicted upon us, a decade of austerity. Quite staggering, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what it shows is he's obviously, as well as being someone who's keen to implement austerity like he has done, he's a big fan of what it's achieved over the last 10 years. And it's nonsense. Even in its own terms, they didn't tackle the size of the fiscal problems. It's true, they got the deficit down a bit, but any idiot can do that if you slash and burn public services and public sector pay and so on. That's not really much of an achievement. An achievement would have been to engineer strong, solid growth, investing in the areas that we are, really they're desperately required, like housing, like catastrophic climate change, like public services, like our education system, and grown our way out of the economic crisis. And if you grow your way out of an economic crisis, then the government's finances take care of themselves, because we all pay taxes, or at least we do if we're not offshore like the Tories donors, and so the government finances improve automatically. But they didn't do that, and as we've seen, we were wholly unprepared for the catastrophe when it struck, and we knew it was going to strike at some point. The government's own documentation talk about all sorts of risks from pandemics and all the rest of it, but they didn't lift a finger to prepare for it. In fact, they did the opposite. PPE and everything else run down.
Exactly. Well, if you think about, remember at the start of the crisis, it was brought to public consciousness, this exercise Cygnus, this paper, this, I suppose, comprehensive look at how you would deal with a pandemic, and there were recommendations in there that were very, very important. And you're right, it wasn't followed through. There wasn't a preparedness for that. In fact, the opposite was done in terms of running down or sucking away those local services from our communities to kind of follow this American US model of healthcare. It can all feel hard, can't it, Michael? People get presented this macroeconomic situation, all of these really big numbers about how they are going to transform the United Kingdom, and people by now are pretty sick of that meaning nothing for their lives. What could be different? I know that's a hard thing to put to you, but you, I'm sure, have spent many, many years thinking about how a different political ideology would handle and try and transform things for the majority of people, rather than a small amount of millionaires.
Okay, well, yeah, that's nice.
It's a big question.
I think the most important thing is not to get downhearted or despondent or demoralized, although I do understand it's easy for me to say when some people are facing absolute nightmarish situations, choosing to have to eat or heat their homes and all the rest of it. That's just unbelievable in a rich economy. But I would also say to people is don't forget we're not alone, because it's very difficult if you're up against a government like this and a whole string of governments that we've had over the past while like this. And we're not alone in this country, because people do want to resist. And we're not alone internationally, because actually, if you look around the world, some people are advancing. It's not going terribly everywhere. And I think learning from them, linking up with them, and the unity of everyone here who wants something better, who doesn't want this state of affairs, that's crucial. To remember who our enemy is my sort of key watchword.
And it was a victory for DPAC, for Unite the Union, for People's Assembly, for other trade unions calling for the continuation of the £20 uplift on universal credit. And that can't be just brushed aside. I do not think they would have done that without significant public pressure.
Yeah, that's a really important point to make, and because of the circumstances we find ourselves, it's interesting where resistance pops up. But you've had really tremendous stuff done by people like Marcus Rashford and more recently Joe Wiley, as well as organised unions trying to resist what Sunak was trying to do, which was cut furlough payments to 2/3, not 80%. And people resisted that, and that was successful. So we have to remember, what was it Bob Crow used to say? That if you don't fight, you'll always lose. But if you fight, at least you have a chance of winning.
You certainly do. So the budget, in essence, is probably 0 out of 10 from us. Nothing to transform working people's lives. Those people who have taken us through this crisis, who have nursed us, who have taught children, who have delivered our mail, who have made sure that the country keeps going. Nothing for them, essentially. Nothing to say that there will be huge injections of resources and money into our communities to make up for a decade-long period of austerity. What else, Michael? What else are the kind of top takes from that budget?
Well, yeah, exactly. You say unemployment's going to go up. That's a given. That's the forecast. That's what the government accepts. There's going to be no big increases in pay. There's not going to be much to talk about in terms of improving on public services. And I think there's a fight on around certain welfare payments, because people have campaigned on it heavily. So like universal credit, but there'll be others. There's the PIP payments. There's others. There's a lot more. And all of those things are going to be a fight. They're not settled in advance. And again, I think that means that we have to be really supportive of everyone who starts the fight on our side, who resists, and unify around them, because I think there are issues that we can register wins on.
I mean, quite incredible that they didn't mention anything about statutory sick pay, knowing that it's one of the main drivers that forces people out of isolation early and coronavirus isolation early, meaning that, of course, that increases the chances that the virus can spread and can be communicated to other people. Absolutely nothing on that. That would be an excellent public health measure. It's completely negligible.
Yeah, and you know, even like back in Victorian times, and believe me, no, Victorian governments weren't any lefties by any stretch. But what they did find is that the refusal to invest in public health actually comes back and bites you all hard. That is disastrous for everyone's health. It's disastrous for the economy and so on. And that's why they did it. It wasn't out of largesse or whatever. And so that's what this government is going to find. You know, the refusal, or is finding, the refusal to support people in self-isolation, the refusal to support people who are self-employed properly. And there's no reason on earth why people's pay has been cut to 80%. You know, it's literally 20% more to keep it at 100%. Why force people to have lower wages? Unless your policy is that you're going to try and keep it in place once the crisis is over, which is what I strongly suspect. So that'll be another big fight.
Well, that is an extremely important point, and you know, there's so much we could talk about. But of course, many people who have been on 80% of the minimum wage are actually, you know, struggling so much. So many in the hospitality sector who have their wages also supported or subsidised by tips, essentially from tipping practices, are really struggling. So I think the big challenges, as you say, are yes, in terms of the social security challenges on statutory sick pay, on universal credit, on, you know, personal independence payments, on, you know, making sure that we keep going to try and get some support back into the social security system. And secondly, the refusal to accept that mass redundancies and mass employment is an inevitability, that there are, number one, state mechanisms that could be used to say that you don't get government money whilst you're making people redundant. But similarly, it's about, you know, wage replacement and the continuation of that when there's a drop in demand, but making the case as a movement to say it's an economic choice to allow so many people to be unemployed, especially when we know that the climate crisis is so vast and so intimidating and such a threat to us all that so many jobs, so many millions of jobs could be created, and really high skilled and well paid jobs that could take us out of the other crisis that we face, the climate crisis.
Yeah, I mean, as was said today I think to the Chancellor, the government's big flagship energy policy is to open a coal mine. You know, what type of policy is that in the face of catastrophic climate change? You know, it's utterly, it's not even ridiculous. It's damaging, and it's just unacceptable. You know, this is not going to get us anywhere where we need to be on addressing these issues. And of course, one of the reasons why they don't do it is because really you can't rely on the private sector. The private sector, left to its own devices, would open coal seams wherever they could. You know, what we need is public sector investment, but the Tories don't want to do that. Hence, you get this ridiculous policy of giving, you know, 13 quid for every 10 quid that the private sector wants to invest.
Michael, thank you so much for your hot takes on the budget, on budget day. And yeah, we could feel downtrodden. We could feel that, you know, we're being spoken to as if this crisis doesn't exist in real terms, where, you know, over 120,000 people have died, where there are still people contracting the virus, where we've got the huge problem of long COVID, where people are experiencing the symptoms and the difficulties of coronavirus still months after they've contracted it. People worried about their future. People worried about the precariousness and the insecurity that they face. And what we have is each other. Now, it might feel a little bit cliche and a little bit, you know, a bit twee, but we do, and practical solidarity will get us through this crisis. So it is about building those networks in industrial solidarity with workers stating their demands. It is about campaigning and organising in workplaces and in communities and on the streets. And if you want to be part of that, please do come and join the People's Assembly, because we have to hold this government to account, and we have to continuously believe that the alternative is possible and inevitable. Michael, thank you so much, and goodbye to everybody.
Thanks for having me, Laura. Thank you.